Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'd really like to welcome you here to the MCC Brussels event, Qatargate, and tell you a little bit more about it in a second, but first of all, just to introduce myself. My name is Tony Gilland. I'm the Head of Outreach and Partnerships at MCC Brussels, and I'm delighted to have joined the organisation just this month and to take part in its really very exciting programme of work, trying to get behind what's going on, behind the headlines, looking at the underlying dynamics of the key issues here in across the European Union. Okay, so without further ado, the topic is familiar to everyone, the origins of Qatargate, what the scandal reveals about the EU. Quite a lot of articles talk about this being something like something out of a crime novel, and that really is the case. If you think about all of the imagery of the €1.5 million stuffed in suitcases, scarcely hidden by nappies and baby food, the four key people arrested in December, including Eva Kaili, the Vice President of the European Parliament, and the NGOs involved. Fight impunity and no peace without justice. And then two more MEPs arrested in February. And the scandal goes on. Henrik Hollerli, the Director General for Mobility, thanks to the reporting of Politico, we found out accepted 9 free flights from Qatar Airlines from 2015. And not only that, he signed off on his own conflict of interest assessment. He signed himself off. And then, for some more really good reporting from Politico just this morning, we find out that he's now stood down, but he's moving on to be the advisor to the Director General for International Partnerships. So plenty more opportunities for freebies for Henrik. Anyway, without further ado, our speakers, we have, first to speak will be Bruno Waterfield. Bruno, thanks for being with us. Bruno is the Brussels correspondent for The Times, and he's one of the longest serving news reporters in Brussels, but also writes on issues across Belgium and Netherlands. So thank you, Bruno. Look forward to your insights. And then we have Frank Furedi, who's our executive director, a well-renowned sociologist internationally. He's published 25 books, and I find particularly helpful, Frank, your Substack Roots and Wings, which really helps me get a handle on this, what is, at times is a surreal world that we're living in, but we need to understand it. That's why we're here. It's very important. Thank you, Bruno. We're going to have Bruno first for 15 minutes, and then Frank will follow for 15 minutes. We'll have a bit of conversation between us, but the key thing is then to get out for all your points and questions.
Okay, thanks very much for the invitation. So I want to focus on the origins of what has been called Qatargate, and I'm assuming a basic knowledge of what happened. And I really want to stress it's not just a scandal involving the criminal behaviour of what we call a few bad apples. So I want to ask, what is corruption? What has been corroded? So what are the scandal's roots? How did the European Union create people like Eva Kaili or Pier Antonio Panzeri, once seen as model MEPs, who thought that rules, even down to criminal law, did not apply to them? How could they have come to believe they were above normal society, living by different norms to the rest of us? So answers can be found, I believe, I will suggest, by looking at corruption's roots in the foundational principles and the institutional basis of the European Union itself. Without reform, and I'm talking about serious reform on the scale of moving from monarchy to a republic or from an oligarchy to a democracy, there will be more scandals. This is just one in a long, long line. They're episodic. Corruption is part of the everyday life of EU institutions, as I will explain. This is not a technical problem to be solved by creating yet another layer of bureaucracy in the secret Byzantine corridors of Brussels. This is political. It's at the heart of European politics and power. So let me take you on a journey. To understand the foundational principle of the EU, it's necessary to go back to 1950, just after the Second World War, the famous Europe or Schuman Declaration, which set in train the current setup. This constitutional document, which is immensely important, much more so than the Treaty of Rome, established a new idea and principle of statecraft as the foundation of a new European order in the wake of the devastation of World War II. It launched the supranational. This concept is not only integral to the EU and wider European statecraft, but also to the identity and political cultures of our new ruling elites today. So the declaration at the time, signed by France, West Germany, Italy, Netherlands, Belgium and Luxembourg, gave proof of their determination to create the first supranational institution, and that thus they are laying the true foundation of an organised Europe. They knew what they were doing. This was very consciously, very deliberately. They knew they were creating something absolutely unique. The Latin word supra is an interesting one. It means to place above, over or beyond. To put the two together, it makes to make institutions supranational means to place them above, over or beyond the national, the nation, the people. Supranational authorities, later in the form of the EU, are the highest. They are above everything, especially the nation. So this principle is now the defining characteristic of the new elite. It's a tenet of faith. They really believe in the superiority, the primacy of the supranational, an institutional order which is particularly expressed in its highest form, the European Union. Now, support for the supranational is one of the markers of the superiority of the new elite, of the Panzeri's et al. Over the rest of society. They are an established caste of finger-wagging, do-gooding high-ups ruling over the less enlightened multitude, the rest of us. Look how MEPs, who sorely lack legitimacy at the national level after all of these scandals, love to talk down from high, de haut en bas, to the European hoi polloi. So Schumann's supranational was realised by setting up what was called a high authority. Back then it was over coal and steel production. That evolved into the European Commission with the Treaty of Rome. It's now extended via the evolution of the EU to home affairs, to borders, national budgets, energy, gay and lesbian rights, you name it, there's a high authority for it. Now, this development had its post-war philosophical roots on both sides of the political spectrum. This is very important, from Hayek, a conservative, to Schumpeter, a social democrat, who were united in a political union of mistrust in nation states where there was popular sovereignty expressed through universal suffrage. Now, this development, the creation of these supranational institutions, has corrupted politics. Who is accountable for the Eurozone austerity that scarred so many countries in the last financial crisis? As national spending fell, EU budgets went up. Who is accountable for pension reforms dictated in Eurozone policy for member states? Note, not nation states, they're member states. Macron is not accountable to French voters. He overrides the French Representative Assembly to implement a policy required by the EU. A higher order that has corrupted national democratic principles of accountability. First and foremost, the supranational principle is the acid test of the new elite. It redefines the public interest away from nations to a higher authority. It's absolutely integral to elite rule and has become so over the last 30 years, often almost invisibly. It is the most profound constitutional development in the conduct of politics since the rise of democracy at the start of the 20th century. It is the defining feature, the highest truth and tenet of faith for the new elite. And this is critical because it is the most regressive development in politics for generations, for over 100 years, because it has built new barriers to democracy and to accountability. Now, the supranational required new institutional forms expressed most vividly by the creation of new EU institutions. The new institutional forms required new people, a new cast of officials and political actors who were supra, above and beyond control by the nation and the national. This meant severing the links between officials, or MEPs for that matter, and accountability to the public, which is constituted historically and practically at the level of the nation or the people. This has been profoundly corrosive and corrupting to democratic mechanisms of accountability, admittedly fragile in many European countries, which were only existed via democratic nation-state structures. The new corrupt culture and practices of the supranational have been exported to the national now over the last 30 years, often via the so-called rule of law doctrine. So just very, very briefly, let's examine how officials, including MEPs, are deliberately made unaccountable to the public by fostering a privileged caste of people whose very existence is founded on slipping the leash of democracy. This brings us back to raw questions of power. Who are the rules for, who benefits from them, and who is accountable and to whom for the exercise of power, policy, and the purse strings of public money. The high salaries, low taxes, and many perks of the caste that run European institutions are justified as making them independent from national influence. It's absolutely explicit in all the oaths that officials take. Time and time again, this creates a culture of sleaze that episodically, with Qatargate, blows up. In the 20 years I've been here, I've seen many scandals, I can tell you. Nothing can be said to be certain except death and taxes, wrote Ben Franklin in 1789. Not for the Eurocrat caste, we can add some 230 years later. Officials earning six-figure salaries pay tiny nominal community tax at far, far lower rates than the people, the public, who pay their salaries. Each deputy in the European Parliament, for example, is paid over 112,000 euros a year, which is taxed at this special low tax rate for EU officials. It's taxed at just 22%. 22%. In Britain, where taxes are lower than the rest of the continent, this salary would be taxed at over 60%. I hate to guess how much I'd have to pay here in Belgium. Not paying national tax is a key tenet, a key foundational operational principle that creates this caste. EU officials in Brussels, who are non-Belgian nationals, also qualify for an expat salary top-up worth 16% of their high salaries, which lasts for their entire working life once they take up their post. Belgians who work in the institutions tend to have their contracts issued in Luxembourg in order to be able to get the perk. Again, this extremely valuable allowance is aimed at fostering a caste identity, and it's been very successful. Back to the European Parliament. MEPs are paid a daily subsistence allowance of 338 euros. This is cash. It is paid totally tax-free to MEPs without the need to show any proof of expenditure. An assiduous MEP can pocket over 66,000 euros a year, leaving plenty of cream to skim off at the top. There are lots of dodges. The allowance is known within the Parliament as the sign-in and slope-off, and MEPs regularly talk, if anyone bothers to check, signing in for the cash before heading home. Just stand on the right floor in the European Parliament on a Friday morning. It's astonishing, or a Thursday morning. Just to put this in context, in 2021, the average annual full-time adjusted salary for employees in the EU was just 33,500 euros. So that a wage that most Europeans can expect is far less, almost half, the daily tax-free cash privilege that the ME caste receive. How am I doing for time, Tony?
About 5 minutes.
Right, okay. I think I'll continue with MEPs because I love this. On top of all this, MEPs are directly and personally paid a general expenditure allowance of 4,778 euros a month, over 57,000 euros annually, to pay for the running costs, not including staffing of their offices outside the Parliament's own building. It's paid tax-free. There are no requirements to prove expenditure, and since last October, MEPs don't have to do any bookkeeping at all to demonstrate they even have an office. The Parliament's Bureau, an administrative body comprised of the Assembly's vice presidents, including the jailed Eva Kaili before she was arrested, has resisted stricter rules. If that was not enough, MEPs have a personal budget of over 321,000 euros a year in parliamentary assistance allowance to pay for their staff. The money is a powerful tool of patronage and nepotism within political parties. Many MEPs use the allowance to ensure their spouses and relatives of their colleagues have well-paid jobs on a quid pro quo basis of you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. In 2008, there was a big scandal when British newspapers, this Correspondent, in fact, revealed widespread abuses of the allowance being paid to the spouses and children of MEPs for often fictitious posts or through family companies. While resisting calls for transparency in their own house, MEPs demand, rightly actually, that the other EU institutions publish full internal audits before Parliament signs off on their annual budget expenditure. There is only one EU institution that keeps its own internal audit highly secret. It's the European Parliament. The reason is very straightforward. It is well known internally that most years the Assembly's own auditor identifies a widespread fraud risk in management of MEP expenses. His reports say secret and the abuses continue. On top of the corrupting pay and perks, over a quarter of MEPs last year had second jobs, collectively worth, according to declarations, up to 11.5 million in outside earnings. And these are just the ones we know about. Under the current accountability-free system, not a single MEP has been sanctioned since 2016, despite widespread flagrant breaches of the rules that have been publicly exposed. By placing institutions and officials above national democratic politics, which are usually more open and accountable, the new caste becomes susceptible to other influences, especially as they are already imbued with a sense of entitlement from lavish principles. Corruption is structural, it is built in. In 2019, after a populist democratic revolt in Italy's European elections, which ejected Panzeri from his office as an MEP, is it surprising that he then acted as he did with 15 years of corrupting caste entitlement in his pockets? His NGO, Fight Impunity, the source of the Qatargate scandal, was a temple to the supranational principle, even to the point of failing to follow Belgium's national rules for the registration of such bodies. The board for his NGO included crusaders for supranational principles, such as Federica Mogherini, Emanino Bonino, Demetrius Avramopoulos, who are among the greatest of the good and high Eurocaste who have real impunity from accountability. They didn't even ask what they were signing up to, for God's sake. What a club. So what is to be done? Firstly, all institutions of public authority must be openly held accountable to common principles and rules that are upheld through oversight and scrutiny conducted in the open. All state officials and MEPs can live with submitting to a higher authority as long as it's other officials, people like them, rather than the public. Look at how this Commission Director General, Heinrich Hollolei, has 9 trips, totally extraordinary. He didn't actually break the Commission's rules. He's the only senior Commission official, as far as we know, who has done this. He's never given any explanation for what he did, and he's just been side-shifted to another job. It's a cosy relationship. The community tax should be scrapped and a new system introduced reflecting national levels of taxation. Not a single MEP should pay lower rates of tax than their voters. No public money or allowances, not a cent, should be paid without public accounting for expenditure. All institutions should publish public accounts with itemised staff costs. This includes plans of establishment showing nationalities and grades. It sounds technical. It doesn't happen. It's very easy to do it. It should happen. We would demand it at the national level. Public officials should have no trips at all paid for outside of their work, let alone signing off on their own luxury jollies, as we've seen. All gifts resulting from the exercise of public office, including in kind above the value of €200 to senior officials, above head of unit level, certainly to MEPs, should be on a mandatory public register. Most importantly, and most radically, the supranational principle needs to be reformed to introduce democratic levels of accountability. Member states must become nation states once more. To repeat where I started, without reform, serious reform on the scale of moving from monarchy to a republic or from an oligarchy to a democracy, there will be more such scandals.
Okay, well, plenty to get our teeth into there, Bruno. Thanks a lot. But first, Frank, please.
Thank you very much, Bruno. And after your talk, I haven't got very much to say because you've given a really good overall view of the scale of the problem. And it seems to me that the really difficult issue for us is to understand what are the cultural and social drivers of corruption within the European Union. Because I don't think we're particularly interested, at least I'm not very interested, in any corrupt individual. And there's a lot of corrupt individuals around, but to me it's the systemic character of corruption that's really at stake. And what I really worry about is this climate of dissolution, of a dissolute climate, where there seems to be no moral discipline that seems to be part and parcel of the furniture that I find really disturbing. And as a sociologist, I know that moral discipline is the only cultural resource that we have to contain corruption. Corruption is not something that you can wish away by rules. You can have 1.5 million ethics committees, not going to make the slightest difference. You can have transparency registers. It's going to make no real impact. It's only when there is a cohort of individuals with moral commitment, with moral discipline, to a particular way of life that you can have that. And the problem that we have in the European Union is that to have moral discipline, you need to have a moral code that people accept and live by, a common sense of morality that really is something they have internalized, something that means something to them, rather than just being a piece of paper. And as you know, whenever you read EU documents, they are pieces of paper. And as we say in England, they're pieces of paper that, not paper that's, worth anything. They're worthless pieces of paper because they're not worth the paper that they're written on. And when you listen to people and their rhetoric, you can just sense the complete absence of a moral imagination behind it. So for me, corruption isn't really about ripping off the public. It is that. That's on an individual scale. Corruption is more fundamental than that. It's an attitude. It's an attitude where public goods that are available for the public, are somehow redirected towards private gain. When they become a private resource, where you can just put your hand into something, take a bit out that's not really yours, and use it for a purpose that's very, very different to what it was intended. I first encountered corruption as an individual personally in the European Union just after 9/11, when at the university where I work, we tried to compete. The United Kingdom was still in the European Union, and we were competing for grants. This is a common exercise. I don't know if any of you ever competed for a grant from the European Union, but basically it demands that you lie, and you lie systematically. And it also demands that you follow rules that you know are inherently wrong. So for example, in my case, I want to do a research project on a subject that I thought was really, really interesting, on things like the way that conspiracy theories worked, the way that rumors occurred within the European Union. I had this wonderful idea. This would be great to get, French, Italian, German, Hungarian, Polish people involved in the same research project. But then, how do I get the grant? Well, the way you get a grant is you go to a consultancy company, which is actually a lobby group, who are in the business of hustling. I mean, they're basically hustlers who are parasitical upon the way that the European Union distributes its resources. And these lobby groups, these consultants, will tell you that this is the way you fill in the application. I don't know if any of you have ever done that. It's surreal. So by the time the application is finished, you've written the application, it bears no relationship to anything that you're interested in. Right? It bears no relationship to anything that you originally started out with, because you're not going to get money. Frank Furedi is not going to get a penny from the European Union if he's simply, honestly pursuing his course of action. You need to kind of finesse it. You got to find out what the European Union is interested in. And as you know, the European Union has got this criteria of what they're interested in for research purposes. And it's usually the most boring things imaginable, or the most fashionable, sort of ideas imaginable. And the point I'm really making is that in the act of doing this, you do feel at several points along the way of taking a shower, you really do feel that somehow something has been soiled in the very act of participating in this, if you got a bit of honesty. And it seems to me that that kind of corrupting influence, which I experience, and it is corrupting, it corrupts the soul. It's not simply about money, and being rich. It basically means that you become something that you weren't. And the point that I'm making is that within the working of the European Union, it does have a resemblance, a historical resemblance to what empires are like. where basically what the empires do with their subject nations is to try to get everybody to go native. Now you arrive in Brussels and you're very enthusiastic. You're representing Poland, you're representing Croatia, you're representing Germany, all these different countries. 2 years later, you open your eyes and you feel that you've lost touch with Croatia, you lost touch with Hungary, you lost touch with your nation state, because you've been somehow integrated into this imperial institution, and you feel very, very different. And these are even really good people. They're honest, good people that started off. It's a bit like the Ottoman Empire. If you read anything about Ottoman history, they would bring in all these Hungarians and Croats and Romanians and everybody else in order to turn them into good Turks, and basically to make them part and parcel of that. The Romans did the same thing quite successfully, where you basically get people from all over the nation state, the subject states in those circumstances, and you turn them into somebody that is very, very different. And I spent it, for the first time in my life today, I spent a whole day in Parliament, sitting around, mainly in the coffee shop, talking to people in between. And it is an experience, it's a sociological experience, where you see basically people hustling each other, where everybody is looking, and the word they use, and it's a very interesting word, I don't know if any of you come across it, the word is access. Right? Access is this fetishized commodity, where everybody wants access to somebody else. Now, how do you get access? Access isn't just simply to a commissioner, to a high commissioner. It's not access to Ursula or somebody really, really big. It's not even an access to an MEP. Access can be to the assistant of an MEP that you want to hustle. And everybody's exchanging, sort of ideas about how you get access to this. If you help me do this, then you help. And you hear MEPs talking to each other, basically saying that if you don't vote for this, I'll help you out in relation to that. Now, I know that there is always horse trading in every political institution. But I mean, there is horse trading where you do that now and again, and horse trading which becomes almost the entirety of your political life, where your whole life is like a focused on this market where access can be gained. In many ways, it's like a medieval court. In a medieval court, you got the king and the queen, you got the courtiers at the center, you got the sort of small town courtiers around them, and then you got all these people who are just kind of, there's a series of concentric circles, and everybody's trying to get gain to somebody who is more important than they are. But the point I'm making here is that when you have that dynamic, it does have a profoundly corrupting influence all around. At the very least because you're no longer what you were beforehand. You're no longer living a life, a public life, which bears any relationship to what has gone on beforehand. So I think that's the first problem. The second problem, which Bruno eloquently alluded to this, is this. When you look at the institutions of the European Union, and this is the unfortunate truth, it's based upon the principle of insulated decision-making, right? Insulated decision-making. What that means is that you're trying to insulate decision-makers and policymakers at every level from public pressure. So the fact that there's no public accountability is not an accident. It's not like, oh my God, let's make ourselves more accountable. Because the institutions are self-consciously created in such a way that political decision-making is outsourced to experts and policymakers. But then you ask the question, who are the experts and policymakers? I mean, who are these experts? So you got all these different kind of committees that are set up to discuss gender at the moment. They're discussing trade or whatever. I just read a report today on academic freedom that's written by a bunch of experts. And these experts are, it wasn't God that made them experts. It's not like somehow, sort of they've been kind of recognized publicly. Experts on these committees are individuals that are chosen because they are your mates, right? So if I want to pass a legislation, I want to pass a law, on academic freedom, for example, I'm not going to get a call from, they're not going to call Frank Furedi and say, we know you've written books on academic freedom, join the club and be an expert, because they know that I'm not going to play the game. But they're going to find people who have different kind of commitments, and they create these groups of experts which look really good on a piece of paper. If you're naive, you see the law, this kind of resolution being passed, and you see 20 names underneath it, professor this, doctor that, sort of head of this. And it looks like as if it's a result of a genuine intellectual and scientific deliberation rather than of horse trading, political horse trading, which is really what it is. So you have this going on, this kind of, and one of the tragedies is that most of the experts are people that are drawn from one constituency in particular, right? They're drawn from the NGO, non-governmental organization sort of milieu. So basically, if you're head of Greenpeace, or if you work in Oxfam, or if you work for any of these big fashionable NGOs, then it's quite likely that you will be given the name stakeholder. I mean, maybe it's my poor English. When I first heard the word stakeholder, I had this image of a guy holding a ribeye steak, and kind of desperately holding that. I think that's what he was, right? In my naivety, I said, this is cool. I love steak. I want to be a stakeholder. Anyway, I now realize that a stakeholder is somebody else, is something very, very different. The stakeholders are usually people that you choose to be lobbied by. I mean, that's the interesting thing about NGO lobbying. The NGO lobbying occurs in such a way that members of certain committees, for example, want to pass a law on the rule of law, right? And they basically want to pass a law on rule of law conditionality. Maybe one of the conditions of the rule of law is that it's got to have a gender component in it no matter what. So they're going to look for stakeholders. And so they're going to get different organizations that are lobbying on LGBTQ issues. They're going to have different organizations that are wedded to transgender ideology. They're going to get people in the medical or other kind of professions who are sympathetic to that cause. And they basically decide, we need you, and this is how it works, we need you, NGO, to lobby us, to tell us what should be as part and parcel of legislation. In other words, when they basically set up an expert group, or when they set up lobbies that basically are going to lobby them, they decide who these people should be. I never get a call, right? I'm still waiting for my first call when somebody says, Frank, you're going to be a new stakeholder. MCC Brussels is unlikely to get a call, unlikely to become a stakeholder to anything that is remotely important, for a very simple reason, that there's a very selective attitude towards this. And that is corrupting. And the reason why that is corrupting, it's not corrupting in the sense that you necessarily give 10 quid or 20 euros to this individual for showing up. It's corrupting because you've created a semi-secret world of horse trading, a kind of world that is not susceptible to democratic decision-making, a kind of a world where, in a sense, important decisions are a result of essentially very cynical manipulation of relationships between different groups and individuals, and where increasingly, as a result of that, what you have is a world where things in public life get done by wink and nods. It's taken for granted. You know me, I know you. Let's have a discussion. So before you have a committee meeting, things are already decided. I mean, the EU, I used to think that the Soviet Union was fairly secretive, and maybe it was, It wasn't the most, sort of open, transparent organization in the world. But in the EU, the norm of secrecy is really, really quite important. I mean, my people at MCC Brussels, and they're not stupid, they're good researchers, spend an inordinate amount of time trying to find out where a piece of legislation comes from. They spend a lot of time trying to figure out, what was the origins of this law? Where was it discussed? And who were the people that were present? Because the unique contribution of the European Union is the absence of publicly available minutes. I mean, even in the Soviet Union, you had minutes. They were made up after the event, right? And they were a bit fictitious, but at least they went through the motion of there being minutes. Here, you have to kind of figure out, well, you know, who did what has happened. And you almost feel like, unless you're a really good detective with forensic skills, it's going to be very difficult to find out the origins of the stuff, you know, who were the individuals that participated in it. And that secrecy is really quite important. It's not the secrecy of a neutral bureaucracy, it's the secrecy of a corrupt bureaucracy. Now, there's one really important point that is not discussed in the literature. And the point is this. We have a European Union Parliament. But the European Parliament, as other organizations, are not really a political institution. Right? There's no, I know they discuss politics, and I know that there are political debates. But the purpose of the institution of the European Union is not to provide a forum for political discussion. It's to make policy. And policy making and politics are very, very different. Policy making is a technocratic accomplishment. It's to do with the use of expertise in different kind of ways. And politics, you know, sort of is very much about debating debating ideals, debating issues in a way that is has as its presupposition different points of views, clashes of views, and all the rest of that. Now, I know that MEPs think of that, and if there's an MEP here, I don't want to insult anybody, but MEPs think of themselves as a politician. But actually, they are a strange hybrid. They're neither politicians in the way that we understand them, nor are they neutral bureaucrats. They basically, their purpose in the European Union is a symbolic one. The role of Parliament is a symbolic one, where they provide a certain expressivist dimension to policy making. And therefore what you have is a situation where, in a sense, it's the policy making which is inherently secretive becomes the dynamic within which this corruption occurs. The final point I would make, and this to me is really quite important, it touches on an issue that Bruno raised, is this. Politics depends on an interaction between clashes of opinion. It depends upon engagement with the public. Right? It requires a certain kind of public life. Now, the problem that we have in the European Union is that there is no public. The MEPs in Parliament haven't got a public. Right? There isn't, you know, when an MEP goes home, he hasn't got a number of constituents to say, why did you say this, why did you do that? In London or in Paris or in Budapest, when an MEP leaves Parliament, they may well be criticized by ordinary people in their streets who voted for them. I mean, that's how democracy works. Here, we have a weird hybrid where you have so-called politicians and parliamentarians, but no public. There isn't a European public. It doesn't exist. I mean, if there is, show me, and I'll take my words back, but you know, when you go out on the streets of Brussels, you don't find a European public anywhere. In fact, what you find is an attempt to elevate yourself above a public. And this, to me, is the key to the corruption dynamic within the European Union. As long as you have people working in the European Union, people making policy in the European Union, without being unrelated to any kind of public, there will be no restraint on their activities. There can be no restraint on their behavior. The only restraint that humankind has ever created for checking the potentially dubious behavior of their politicians is public, is democracy, it's accountability. Without that kind of restraining element, individuals will go their own way. Some will be all right. Not every MEP is corrupt. Some will be really good. Some will get very angry and they say, I want to be honest and I will stand up and fight for my commitments. but others will go down a different track. And the tragedy is that if you leave it up to an individual to be good or bad, if you leave it up to their subjectivity to decide which direction they're going in without there being any restraining element, then the forces of corruption, that kind of corrosive element that's in the air, is going to get stronger and stronger and stronger and stronger, to the point at which it is not even recognized as corruption anymore. It's recognized as this is the way we do stuff. This is the way we do stuff. And it seems to me that this is a very important issue, because what the Qatargate, and I don't want to call it Qatargate because it really should be Morocco-gate, but that's a different discussion. You know, I think that if you look at the corruption, Morocco plays a more important role here than Qatar. I think that the thing that this has really kind of brought out is that there is a fundamental legitimacy crisis within the European Union. A legitimacy crisis that until now the European Union has tried to limit by using NGOs and their moral authority as a stalking horse. Until this point, if you look at the way that so-called civic society is used by the European Parliament and the European Commission all the time, you can see that from their point of view, the role of the NGOs is essentially a public relations one. It's impression management. You know, bring them on side, develop a relationship with them, and they will provide moral authority for whatever we do. And that's important, because as you know, in the European Union, even now, a lot of people love the European Union, but nobody gets up in the morning, brushes their teeth, and says, oh, the European Union is the high point of my life. It is the most wonderful institution. Nobody says that. We have a very pragmatic sort of way of reacting to this. So when you have a legitimacy crisis, you really need something like the NGOs to cover your track, to provide you with that kind of cover. And what we find is that with this Qatargate, we can see that the NGOs, which provided the moral cover for the European Union, are not a solution, but are part of the problem. And I think this will have some very important consequences in the long run. And I think people like ourselves in this room got to understand that if you're going to fight corruption in the European Union, there's no point beginning in the Commission and looking there. We got to expose these NGOs who dance around and play this kind of game, who willingly prostitute themselves as the handmaiden of some very dodgy individuals up there in the Commission. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Frank. I'm sure you'll be very keen to ask some questions. Just to give you a moment to think about the questions or the points that you want to make, I just want to ask Bruno, to give you the chance to reflect on points that Frank has made, whether they adjust your thinking in any way, particularly around the NGOs and particularly about your hopes for improving the situation. What's your take on Frank's comments?
I think it is very important. I've been here 20 years. It is very important to observe how the integration of people into the life of the institutions, an integration process that's well lubricated and oiled by those kind of caste privileges I was talking about, how it does suck people in. It quite often hollows people out, it destroys them as well. A lot of people become very unhappy, very disillusioned, very quickly. I thought his observations on making an application for European Union funding, something I actually know quite a lot about from my past. No European Union application is a truthful document. It's the opposite of a truthful document, like the system of organised corruption in the European Parliament. By participating in it, you become a client of it because you have effectively prostituted yourself. You have effectively been complicit in a setup, and that can reverberate on you. Any nation state that's been a recipient of EU funding now, particularly in the era of the rule of law doctrine, knows what a two-edged sword that complicity is. I just want to say something else on the secrecy, because that's something as a journalist who attempts to report on the European Union is very important. There is no there is no accountability, literally no accountability, into the terms of how legislation arrives. It arrives as a fait accompli. You don't know what the counter proposals were, you don't know who supported it, why they supported it. The votes are there, but usually the kind of horse trading Frank was talking about that's gone on before the vote renders the vote absolutely meaningless, because you can see where countries have voted against, voted for something that was once against their stated interest, because they've been bought off with something else. In terms of the European Parliament, in terms of optimism, I wouldn't be optimistic about the European Parliament ever. I've known a lot of MEPs over the years. Some of them I've counted as friends. Some of them were very, very honourable, very decent people. Most of them are not. The only solution to the European Parliament is actually to abolish it and to actually move back to something which didn't work too badly, something which works very well in the Council of Europe, which is a parliamentary assembly that reflects the electoral cycles in nation states, and where the people that take part in scrutinising European legislation and decision makings are actually accountable at that national level, where democratic mechanisms of accountability are historically situated.
Thank you. I'm Peter Kuter from the Foundation for Civic Hungary. I would like to ask maybe both of you that I think that many people in the Brussels level actually share the criticism that you made towards the European Parliament, that the MEPs are distant from their voters, and there is a democratic deficit there. But this is why the European Commission, I believe, came forward with the idea of the transnational list, because the European Parliament, so the political parties, the European political parties, does not function like national parties, and so with the transnational list, they would have more of those features. So I wanted to ask you your opinion about this proposal, and that if you don't agree, I just heard from Bruno the alternative that we should abolish the European Parliament. But what's your alternative for going forward? Then, if you don't agree with this.
Okay, thanks very much. And let's just take a couple of questions at a time. Yes, please, at the front.
Herman Kelly is my name, press officer for Christian Rights in the European Parliament. I was struck by your phrase, Bruno, nation states, not member states. And of course, nation states are marked by having a demos, which is the foundation of having a democracy, something which is absent from the European Union. Would you think that the EU would be a bit like the Taliban in Afghanistan, in order to create or attempt to create a demos, what is necessary is a massive campaign of historical and cultural destruction to wipe out everything that is unique and to the different peoples of Europe? Is that what could be necessary to create a demos for the EU?
Thanks very much. Interesting question. And we'll take one more. Yes, please.
Hi, I'm Peter Kleppe, Brussels Report. Question for Bruno. You've been here a very long time, Telegraph, Times, and well, I think you'll agree that the media scrutiny of the European Union is suboptimal. Do you think this has improved or worsened during the time that you're here in Brussels?
Okay, thanks very much, Peter. Right, Frank, would you like to go first?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there is no such thing as a European demos, and you cannot, if you created one, it'd be horrific, because then you would extinguish all the national differences and all the contextual issues that are nation-specific, and you'd end up in a kind of in a situation that resembles what the Soviet Union was like in the old days, where basically it didn't matter where you came from, Armenia or Azerbaijan or Georgia. You had the same school curriculum, you had very much the same kind of impulses, which I think is not what Europe is about. See, if we actually believe that Europe is a Europe of nations, then why don't we use the nations as the organizational principle for international cooperation? why not basically have a European Union that is a union of nations, but doesn't pretend to, in a sense, create a supranational political institution that puts its nose into the business of the different parts of the country, of the continent, when we have, very different ideals in Southern Europe to the way that East Europeans or Central Europeans behave. There's a different impulses that are worked there. Why don't we celebrate that and let each nation find its own way in terms of political, then trying to bring them together and find a common denominator. So I would say that from my perspective, the most democratic solution to this, and the one that would limit corruption the most effectively, is to eradicate the very principle of parliamentarism, beyond the nation state, because parliamentarism beyond the nation state turns into a joke. It's a caricature. It pretends to be a parliament, but it really isn't, except in name. And the parliamentarians, even the really good ones, aren't doing what parliamentarians do within a nation state. The best ones, protect the interest of their nation. The bad ones, forget about their national identities and become part of the problem. So I would say we don't need parliaments. We don't need any kind of institutions. Basically, we need the national governments establishing a bureaucracy, and that is a bureaucracy. It doesn't pretend to be anything else than a technical bureaucracy, to ensure that cooperation is lubricated properly, and that economic and social and cultural matters that matter to everybody are properly kind of carried out. But it basically means getting back to the pre-federalist moment in EU history and getting back to a non-federalist European Union that is a union rather than a kind of a quasi-empire.
Okay, Frank, could I just ask you just to elaborate on one aspect of that? Because a lot of people that I hear over the time I've been going to many events here would say something like, well, actually, if you just look at things like the single market or the new Green Deal, it's a very, very difficult and complex process to come to some sort of agreement about how to go forward together. So, in a way, if you're going to have a union in the way in which you're suggesting, wouldn't you actually then be ruling out a lot of what the European Union does today? In other words, you'd have to make a sacrifice, is what they would say. You're going to lose a lot of the benefits of the single market.
I would say that rather than a sacrifice, that would be a benefit, because it would mean that if people in Italy, wanted to cook their pizza in a way that makes sense to their cuisine rather than according to the regulation that's issued by Brussels, I think it'd be a more delicious pizza for them. And I'm just using that example because at the moment, once you have these institutions, that then the imperative of if it moves, regulated, which is what exists now, non-existent regulation, except the only thing you don't regulate is yourself, then you end up in a situation where I think a lot of unnecessary, harmful things are done. And I would rather we had smaller numbers of things that were part of that union, free movement, economic cooperation, all the obvious ones, and forgot about having to have a common view on gender. Why should Hungarians or why should Irish people have the same view on gender politics? And why should the same rule apply to all of them? That's nobody else's business. Whereas, in fact, what we're seeing is that because of all these benefits, the number of areas that are becoming subject to supranational regulation is increasing all the time. It's never less. They never say, we over-regulated here, we'll forget about it. It's always more and more regulation, year by year. And that's not a world, I think, that is hospitable to democratic decision-making.
Okay, thanks very much. Bruno, your take on any of these questions, and also perhaps this rather radical idea of going back to a more limited union between nations.
Look, is the European Union an amazingly complex place for you? You certainly have to be a graduate, probably have come from the College of Europe in Bruges to understand is utter nonsense. Most of the decisions that are taken here are actually pretty rudimentary. They're very straightforward. They might not be expressed in that way because they're expressed in the langue de bois and a particular kind of legalese that has emerged from a school of jurism and law. But actually, the trade-offs can be complex because you're talking about 27 countries, but they're trade-offs. The problem is we don't know, because we don't know what the trade-offs are. We don't know what deal was arrived at, why it was that maybe France argued one thing at the beginning and then was prepared to go along with it at the other end, because the decisions just emerge at the end of the process. We don't even know what kind of sausage it is as it comes out of the machine. So the complexity of EU decision making is a complete mythology. It's actually a lie. It's totally self-serving conceit of people who work here who want to make it complicated. They want to make it complicated because that obscures the decisions that are actually being taken. Transnational list. The only head of state or government I can think of who supports the idea of a transnational list is actually Emmanuel Macron. He's quite happy with the idea of utterly severing the link between being a politician and any accountability to the people you represent. Look, he's doing it right now. He's just done it with the French National Assembly. The transnational list is the last gasp, if you like, to completely allow the European Parliament to float off God knows where. If you want to see a European Union demos in action, you can find them actually online on EBS. Watch a citizens forum in the European Parliament. I mean, they are dead, they are moribund, and the people at them, often young people who've been selected randomly, are put up in a hotel, not allowed to drink too much, that's regulated of course, just in case they have too much fun, and they're told, look, you can come back again, you can have another free trip, if it goes well, which means, parrot the line, and all the rest of it. They are astonishing, and they are as dead as anything that was produced by the Austro-Hungarian Empire,
that was a good empire, relatively.
or the Soviet Union. On the media front, I think it is quite interesting. I think there has been a circling of wagons because of the ongoing development of what's called populism in the European Union. So people tend to circle. They're always telling us it's dead. By the way, I've been here 20 years, and every year I've been told that populism is dead. But I think there actually have been some quite positive developments. I actually think Politico, for example, is quite a positive development, just because they, slavishly actually report on every twist and turn in what goes on in Brussels, fact which they can find out about because they're up against the same wall of secrecy as everything else. So that's actually quite a good thing, because it means that the public or anyone who's interested in looking at it can actually find out a little bit more about what is going on.
Okay, thanks very much, Bruno. Right, so plenty of time for more comments from yourselves. Feel free to ask a question, but if you just want to make a statement, that's fine. Yes, there, please.
I'm Ante, I work in the European Parliament.
Just speak up a little bit for us.
Okay, sorry. I'm Ante, I'm coming from the European Parliament. I'm here as in traineeship, and I have a question for Mr. Frank. As you said about the European Parliament, when I'm looking at it from a perspective of law, I must tell that it has certain good benefits from people of European Union, especially regarding treaties and harmonization of law in international context, and it really can be good, and it really can help people, and also it can reduce costs of administration and so on. But what is concerning, and what you already mentioned, are NGOs and ideology that are which is financed by NGOs particularly, and I think that in some way we should all unite and stop that, because there is no place for any ideology in the European Parliament, because we are many countries in the European Union as the member states, we all have our own sovereignty, and that should be respected because the principle of subsidiarity is one of the most important principles of European Parliament, and that should be respected as such. And also my question to you is, how do you think that we can stop NGOs financing such ideologies?
That's great. Thank you very much for those points. We'll bring Frank and Bruno back in a moment. Just want to give a couple other people opportunities. So who else would like to make a comment, offer any perspective, or just ask a question? Yes, please, at the front.
Thomas Orban, European Conservative. So what I understood, this problem is not with individuals, but with the system itself. It's inherent at some levels, or multiple levels of them. So why is that during the Qatargate we saw mainly leftist MEPs being caught up with it and not conservative ones?
Okay, good question. Thank you. Yes, at the front.
I'll throw a grenade in there. Just Joe Barnes from the Daily Telegraph. Frank, there are European people, and they are people that reject Brexit in the UK every day, and they say free hails to the EU flag. But no, my point is, it's a bit of a grenade. Qatargate is probably the wrong name for it because we've seen this idea of countries outside of the EU lobbying to be part of, to get deals from the EU for a long time, or something, or some to curry favour. I remember some Brexit Party MEPs with some of their right-wing colleagues went to Kashmir at the back end of their time in the European Parliament. There are other parliamentarians in the EU that take cash from companies like Huawei who are linked to the Chinese state, and I'm sure that we can find a number of MEPs, if we really poured through the list, who accepted finance in the form of football tickets from Gazprom and Champions League games. So I just wanted to say, is it a sign of the European Union's importance geopolitically that countries feel the need to use their sort of intermediaries in state-backed or state-owned companies to try and influence what is going on inside the EU?
Okay, great question. Thanks. Okay, so we'll take those three together, and then we'll go out for one last round. Frank.
Yeah, on the last point, I think it is very much the case that the European Union has become one of the biggest markets in the world. I mean, when you look at America, China, sort of the European Union, it's a huge market. And it's a market that is particularly permeable, despite the protectionist tendencies. And it's a market that is particularly loved by certain kinds of governments. So Qatar has made some huge investments in the recent period in France and in Germany. Qatar is a very powerful position because it supplies liquid gas to Europe. Europe really needs that. So Qatar knows that they can basically clean up in Europe, not just by football teams, like a club I'm not going to mention in Paris, but also to achieve some very positive results, buying up a phenomenal amount of real estate properties and everything else. And I think in the course of that, access for Morocco, Qatar becomes, and China. I mean, we haven't talked about China, but I mean, China has been corrupting ending the moves in Europe for a very, very long time. So there is that kind of impulse that has occurred there. I just want to say one thing about your question, and I'm not going to be very popular for saying this, but there is a kind of a trope amongst conservatives where they're very happy that almost everybody that's been caught out in Qatargate is on the left. And they're on the left. But I can tell you that conservative people working in the parliament are not angels. And I'm fairly sure that you'll find that corruption does not recognize ideologies and political commitments within the European Union. And it's quite important that we don't, for pragmatic reasons, say, look at the left doing this, because it will come back to bite us when people are ostensibly on our sides are going to be exposed as doing some very dubious things. And there is, if you look back over the last 30 years, there have been numerous individuals, especially at the time when Europe went and tried to adopt the euro, where people from the other side were also pretty much involved in many of these things. So we do need to be a little bit balanced, so we don't just say that, that we don't react to Qatargate entirely pragmatically, because there's a deeper principle at stake here, and the principle is really, really important. I agree with you that treaties are really important, and I'm not against the things that you would like to see. Anything that harmonizes economic, cultural, social relations is a really good thing. But I do think that the European Union at the moment, because of its secrecy, the way it's organized, its Byzantine qualities, is not doing a good job. And I think the best example of the dangers of this kind of bureaucracy that's also very political at the same time is what happened in the pandemic. Because you would have hoped that during the pandemic, the European Union, for all its talk, would have gone out of its way and provided an effective policy for getting vaccinations, for dealing with the health issues that kind of confronted the whole continent. And we discovered almost immediately that in the end, people were forced to rely on their national governments rather than on Ursula, to kind of, and her husband, who was doing the deals, to kind of sort this thing out. And I just think that there's a very good lesson there, which I would say that if we have a quasi-hybrid Mandarin class that's also political, then they're not going to be paying attention to the good of the continent. They're not going to be as effective as we need them to be, where they can play a really good role. So the sad thing is that where they could play a really good role, they're getting distracted by the corrupting influence of their organization, and where they are never going to play a good role, they're busier and busier. So every day you will find, and I can bet you that by the time we finish this meeting, there's going to be 2 more rules that will bring in gender mainstreaming somewhere. I mean, they hide these little things secretly in the most obscure places. We don't need that. I mean, we just don't need that. And we need I believe in Europe. I believe in the European Union, but I want to see something very, very different crystallizing itself out of the problems that we've created at the present moment.
Thanks very much, Frank. Bruno, I wanted to get your take on these questions, but also that question at the back there from Ant about harmonisation, treaties, etc. He referenced the rule of law, and you said something very interesting in your introductory remarks, if you might remember. You talked about the exporting of corruption to nations, and you mentioned that in relation to the rule of law project. And I just wondered if you could expand on that a bit, because I thought it was a very key point that you made that we haven't really drawn out, and in relation to that question.
Okay. My point there is that the rule of law doctrine, it is a doctrine, it's comparatively recent one, despite the existence of the European Court of Justice and all the rest of it, going right back to the foundation. It's a doctrine that's comparatively recent, is one that exports practices and certain models with the full weight of law behind it, to countries that are seen as not being in line culturally also with those doctrines and practices. So as Frank explained, and as is the experience of anyone who's ever had their hands dirtied by European Union funding, is inherently and by nature corrupt and corrupting. It's been around for a long time. Whole political parties, Christian Democrat and Socialist, have built client systems in countries such as Greece, Italy, Spain, some parts of France, some parts of Germany on it. No one ever said anything about it, because the political parties that it was propping up, the political parties who were building systems of patronage and corruption and procurement for your best mate and all the rest of it, were in line with the prevailing doctrine in the EU, the end of history. They were Christian Democrat, EPP or PES, Social Democrats. It's only countries that have rebelled against that doctrine, the foundational principles of the EU, primarily Poland and Hungary, who have come across the rule of law doctrine, because it's actually got nothing to do with practices, got nothing to do with corrupt practices, and there are certainly corrupt practices in Poland and Hungary, as there were in Spain and Italy, all the rest of it. It's got to do with bringing countries that aren't towing the line into line. That's all it's all it's about. I actually think there is a really big problem, and the European Union is the most exposed on this, but the US is, countries like Britain are. A lot of countries in a world where geopolitics has been working have not really operated on that basis and have been far too open to foreign influences. Far too much infrastructure, for example, in the United Kingdom is run by foreign countries, companies, many of them American. If you look at the impact of Chinese shipping companies in terms of absolutely critical supply lines in Europe, I include Britain in that too, something that actually is vital to the national security, the actual preservation of those societies has actually been outsourced elsewhere, and that's why these societies are so permeable. And when states, when apparatuses lose that linkage to the nation and become engaged in something more supranational, the more outsourcing you get, and the rivals, the foreign powers who aren't necessarily friends of democracy or friends of freedom can smell that very quickly, and of course they've found many biddable people who will do their bidding, even if it's just for a Rolex. And I think it's really important to note that the practices, which are ideological in character because they're about administration and about rules that define most people as morally inferior, that is ideological. But it's not the old kind of ideology. It's not socialist versus Christian Democrat. In fact, the distinction between the EPP and the socialists is meaningless. They are actually part of the same establishment. They subscribe to all these foundational principles. The divide, the cleavage in politics is the battle, the political battle between them and populism, which is defined by the involvement of people, the nation in politics, and defines public goods as being linked to democracy and democratic accountability. That is the cleavage in European societies. The difference between, Manfred Weber and whoever it is who's in charge of PS at the moment, I can't pronounce her name. They're both equally bad as each other.
Okay, thanks, Bruno. Right, so we've got some more comments. Take my colleague, Professor Bill Furedi at the back there.
Thank you. I'm a visiting professor to the MCC here in Brussels. I'm chair of risk and security at the University of Bath in the UK. I think it's obvious to us that there's been a huge explosion of rules and regulation for a very long time. And clearly, that must be in inverse proportion to authority, to moral authority in society. I mean, just do a thought experiment for a minute. If you go out in the street and start spitting at old people, does it mean that the European Parliament or the Commission needs to bring in a rule tomorrow to say that it is wrong to spit at old people? It rather reflects a crisis of morality in society. All these rules and regulations reflect a crisis of morality. Even rules that say that we must treat each other equally, because the authority of treating each other equally comes from the authors, who are us, rather than the rule makers who dictate to us. And that's the kind of fundamental problem. One of the things I like doing with my students at the moment is asking almost every group that I teach whether they would be prepared to fight for their country. And it's very interesting that in the main, the British people are quite reticent to say that they would do such a thing. Now, I'm not asking my students to go and fight for their country. John Stuart Mill told us that war is an ugly thing, but he also reminded us that there's one thing more ugly than war, which is to believe that nothing is worth fighting for. And I do think the Ukrainian people in the contemporary period have done us all a favour by showing that people who believe in the freedom and independence of their country and who have a sense of belonging to that country are willing to drop whatever it is that they're doing and to go and do that. I think one of the problems that we're confronting is that people simply don't believe in their nation state anymore. Rather than imagining that somehow the people who voted to remain in the European Union, the British citizens who voted to remain, are EU citizens, I can't imagine anything worse. International relations is the relations between nation states. Only people who are proud of the state that they belong to and have a sense of attachment to it are willing to stand their heads above the parapet and do anything about it.
Thanks very much. Okay, we've got time for a couple more. And also feel free, as I say, to just ask a question or to put a different point of view if you want to challenge some of what the speakers have said. Anybody from this side? I can see it's Herman, isn't it? Yeah, I can see you, Herman, just to give people a chance who haven't spoken already. Okay, so I'll take Herman and then I'll take my colleague Jacob.
Don't
and
worry.
then ask the speakers to sum up.
It's a quick story to illustrate a point rather than a question. And it's to do with the point that Bruno said there. It's not so much about the EPP against the socialists, but it's more about those who are in, those who are out, the federalists again. I'm here 13 years, but even sometimes I get a big surprise. And once, you may remember when Martin Schulz ran for Chancellor in Germany, and we had done up quite a large file of Martin Schulz, his crimes, sins and misdemeanors, and corruption, paying off his friends in Berlin, etc. And basically I took this to, I would say, a very senior member of the press gang in the EPP group, thinking that they would lap this up. This is all ammo in Martin Schulz. We've got it, we'll use it, and we'll take him down, we'll destroy him, and the EPP candidate will come in. And to my great surprise, he said, no, we don't want it, we're not interested. He's not the enemy. You're the enemy. You Eurosceptics, you nationalists, you're the enemy. And even in my, experience and cynicism, I think I've seen it all, but even that surprised me. But it does illustrate that point. It's not about left and right, it's about those who believe in the nation state and national democracy, and those who believe in a federal Europe and accountability to the bank manager.
Okay, thanks for that comment. Jacob.
Yeah, I just wondered if the panel had some thoughts on what strikes me as a particularly perverse dynamic in the discussions around the EU. So if you complain that there's not enough transparency, for example, in the way that the EU operates, they'll say, oh, well, nobody cares more about transparency than us. That's why we've invited Transparency International to come and sort it all out for us, which just intensifies the very kind of dynamic of an unhealthy relationship between the EU and NGOs. If you say there's a problem with the way the bureaucracy works, the civil service in the EU such that it exists, they don't take their jobs, they're not serious bureaucrats anymore. They say, well, nobody cares about bureaucracy more than us. We've instituted a whole number of extra processes and procedures to try and fix it. And then with democracy, if you say there's a problem with democracy in the EU, they say, yeah, but again, nobody cares more about democracy than us. That's why we're going to try. That's why we've been campaigning for ages to beef up the European Parliament, to create a kind of transnational list to really allow people to have a proper say in how the EU works, which, in the absence of an EU demos, just intensifies the distance between the EU and the people. So that these kind of self-fulfilling dynamics seem to be at the heart of the way the EU responds to crises, and I wonder if the panel had some thoughts on that.
Okay, thanks very much. Right, so Bruno, if you could answer the questions, but also leave us with your parting thoughts.
No, I think that point there about transparency is one that is dear to me. It's not about transparency; it's about openness. So transparency. Every EU institution is transparent. They'll assure you they have a register where you can transparently apply to get documents, and you will be transparently told that you can't have them because that request would threaten the integrity of European decision-making, because the integrity of European decision-making is absolutely defined by the secrecy that avoids clashes of interest becoming clashes of public interest. As with democracy, they love it. They love it as long as it's an MEP and the right sort of MEP. They don't like democracy when it's referendums on the European Constitutional Treaty. They don't like democracy when it's Britain leaving to the leaving to the EU. They like democracy essentially when it is a handmaiden to what they want to do anyway. Democracy in this town is a citizens' forum or a youth parliament down the road around Gare, Luxembourg. I just want to just say something. Again, it's about this sort of exporting tendency, or the thing that's really interesting about the European Union is it is a very, very kind of voracious beast. It sort of swallows lots of things up. It can probably integrate more or less anything, and it has had a real effect, I think, over the last 30 years. I think it's becoming very apparent, and the Russia's invasion of Ukraine has shown this in many ways. The pandemic and the disruption that caused to so-called globalized supply chains, as well, is that states that have sundered or emancipated themselves from nations and accountability through democratic mechanisms really do quite quickly lose the capacity to actually exercise statehood itself. Pooled sovereignty actually ends up with nobody being sovereign. The states that buy into it become increasingly unable to adapt to changing social conditions, which leads to incredibly reactionary policies during the Eurozone, very destructive ones economically that we're still paying for. Very poor decisions, because these apparatuses, these institutions have been corrupted and eroded to the point where they can barely even function on their own terms. And it's fascinating to watch in Britain, after Britain has left the European Union, to watch the British state apparatus, which is manned by some pretty clever people, has some very formidable bureaucratic machines, but how utterly incapable and adrift it has been. And there's a real lesson there for us all. And that's one of the things that really does need to be rescued. We need to rescue the nation state. Why do we need to rescue the nation state? Because we live in a bloody dangerous world. We need it.
Okay. Thank you, Bruno. Frank?
Well, there's a problem with what Bruno says, which is that the way that the European Union has worked is actually to outsource decision-making to expert groups, but also many national governments, the Germans in particular, but also the Italians and the French, have outsourced their decision-making to the EU. So whenever you want to make an unpopular decision, then what you say, oh no, it wasn't us, it was a European Union directive that is responsible for that. And therefore there's an intertwining of political alliances involving the most unlikely characters, which is why you'll find that the EPP is very often as guilty as the Renew people, the Greens and the left, in basically eating out of the same plate and having a very similar appetite. And I think that's a massive problem for us. Now, I know that I'm in a privileged position because I'm not an MEP. I don't have to work with these people. I don't have to make pragmatic compromises, which are really involved in this. I can say whatever I want, and it's got no consequences. So I am aware of the fact that I'm in a privileged position, and you might say, well, it might be a little bit ultimatistic in what's been said here. But I do think that whatever we think about the issues, there are a number of matters that we can all agree on. It's very interesting that at the moment there's a debate. I was quite surprised that it's even a debate about whether or not to regulate foreign NGOs in Belgium, in Brussels, which I think makes perfect sense. America's got a Foreign Agent Act. Hungary, I think, is hoping to introduce one. It might have one, I'm not really sure. But certainly, I would imagine that if you have foreign NGOs representing foreign interests within the EU bubble, then they should, at the very least, be regulated. Their role needs to be made completely transparent, because they represent an interest that might be antithetical to that of the people of the European Union. And I thought it was interesting that the NGOs, who are always for transparency, have reacted against this and said that if you're going to do this, if you're going to regulate foreign NGOs, then that undermines our moral authority. And that exposes really what they are like. So I think that there are steps that can be taken from regulating the NGOs, making them, the foreign ones, make it very, very clear that they represent interests, but then also to basically hold NGOs into account more systematically. I think that we could take some small steps that aren't going to solve the problem of corruption, but at least would make it a teeny bit more difficult if we kind of got rid of the regime of secrecy, of committee secrecy, which prevails at the moment within Europe. It's a small step, I know, because we all know that secrecy creates a terrain where corruption will flourish, but it's a very, very important one, because if you take away the veil of secrecy, then what people do and what people say might be less harmful to public life within Europe than is the case at the moment. So there are some small steps that could be done. But I think if you want to get rid of corruption in its present form, and you could never get rid of corruption altogether unless there's much greater moral character and moral strength, is really basically to challenge the federalist principle and make it very, very clear that a union of nations is what's going to create a much better public space within the European continent. A European Union is what is going to represent an important step forward and defend the continent far more effectively than a little kind of mini empire that's being built under the wings of the federalists. And I think that's where the big battle should be fought. And we should be systematically challenging this continuous impulse on encroaching on more and more dimensions of our lives.
Thank you very much, Frank. So just before we thank our speakers, if I could just give you just a couple of pointers so we can carry on the conversation. It's been absolutely illuminating and I think very, very important conversation. We can carry on the conversation just outside where we've got some light refreshments. Secondly, please pick up from the reception desk, and if we can make sure on the reception desk these are there. We've got a flyer about our publications. We've got some really excellent publications which take forward some of these issues, so please pick up that flyer. And finally, if you think this has been an important conversation, if it's made you think, if it's made you perhaps even want to think about things differently, please make sure you're on our mailing list, but far, far more importantly, tell other people about MCC Brussels being in town, because we are the new kid on the block, but actually we're doing something fundamentally worthwhile. And if you agree with that, let other people know. If we could thank our speakers.